My stepbrother joined me in the swimming pool, and his behavior started to suggest a romantic interest. I'll explain what unfolded in this video, but first, let me set the scene. It was one of those seemingly endless summer days where the heat clung to you like a damp shirt. Even the shade offered little relief. It was a dense, heavy warmth that made the days melt into one another. With few escapes, the pool became our sanctuary, a place to immerse ourselves in the cool water and, at least temporarily, forget the world outside. My stepbrother and I weren't close. We weren't exactly enemies, but we hadn't developed a strong bond. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement to simply coexist. He'd entered my life abruptly, unexpectedly, and even after all this time we hadn't quite figured each other out. He was a constant fixture, yet somehow always felt just beyond my reach. On those scorching days, we'd often gravitate towards the pool without exchanging a word. We didn't need to. The silence seemed to suit us. There was a strange comfort in it, a kind of separation that kept things uncomplicated. But that summer, things felt different. The change was subtle at first, just small shifts I might have overlooked had they not accumulated, building a tension I couldn't ignore. I recall the way he looked that day, perched on the pool's edge, legs dipping into the water, shoulders slumped in his usual relaxed posture. His wet hair clung to his forehead, and he seemed oblivious, or simply unconcerned. The setting sun cast a warm, gentle glow on everything, making the water shimmer like glass. He appeared lost in thought, gazing at something far beyond my line of sight. Then, he looked at me. It was a brief glance, one I nearly missed, but there was something in his eyes that caught me off guard. It wasn't the usual casual look he'd give to make sure I wasn't in distress. This was different. He was observing me, not with his typical guarded detachment, but with something that felt closer, more intimate. I entered the water quietly, letting the coolness envelop me, hoping it would quell the unfamiliar feeling stirring within me. It didn't. I could sense his gaze lingering, not just once, but repeatedly, and I began to wonder why. Why was he looking at me like that? The atmosphere between us felt thicker, charged with an unspoken energy I couldn't define but couldn't dismiss. I wanted to speak, to shatter the silence that now felt oppressive, but the words wouldn't form. So I just floated there, looking up at the darkening sky, allowing the moment to stretch, neither of us making a move. For a moment, that was sufficient. But as time passed, I couldn't escape the sense that something had shifted between us, subtly yet undeniably. It felt like we'd crossed an invisible line, unintentionally, and there was no turning back. The following day, I attempted to dismiss the strange feeling from the pool, convincing myself it was nothing, just a trick of the heat, or maybe my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about the way he'd looked at me, the way the silence had enveloped us like a weighted blanket, refusing to lift. As the day progressed, the air grew denser, the kind of heat that slowed everything down, intensified everything. By afternoon, being indoors was unbearable. I grabbed my towel and headed for the pool, and just like the day before, he was already there. He was lounging against the pool's edge, eyes half closed, hands draped over the side, looking utterly at ease. For a moment I thought about turning back, pretending I hadn't seen him. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was the memory of that look, or the way I'd felt his eyes on me even after I'd gone to bed the previous night. Whatever it was, it kept me rooted to the spot, unwilling to retreat. Instead, I quietly slipped into the water, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he did. He always did. "You've been swimming a lot lately," he remarked, his voice soft, almost pensive. It was a simple observation, casual enough to pass as idle chatter, but it felt significant, like he was implying something more, like he was taking notice of me in a way he hadn't before. I shrugged, trying to maintain a steady voice. "Just trying to stay in shape," I replied, avoiding his gaze, focusing instead on the ripples expanding around me. But even without looking at him, I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze, the way it lingered a beat too long, just like yesterday. There was a pause, a brief silence that felt like an unanswered question hanging between us. "I noticed," he finally said, his voice lower now, a murmur just above the sound of the water. And I couldn't help but wonder, noticed what? That I was there? That I'd been coming to the pool every day seeking refuge? Or had he noticed something else, something I hadn't intended for him to see? I glanced at him briefly, and our eyes met. There it was again, that look, the same quiet intensity that seemed to communicate more than either of us was prepared to express. I felt my heart flutter, a jolt of electricity coursing through me, and I quickly looked away, hoping he hadn't seen my reaction. But he had. I could tell by the way he was watching me, waiting, like he knew precisely what was going through my mind, even though I barely understood it myself. We remained like that for a while, We floated there, side by side in the water, not touching. But the silence felt different now, heavier, as if we were both anticipating something, yet neither of us knew what. As the sun descended, casting long shadows across the pool, I realized that whatever was developing between us was only just the beginning. The days that followed were far from ordinary. The pool had become a silent stage for something neither of us fully grasped. We didn't discuss it, yet every time we were alone there, the tension intensified, as if something unspoken was brewing, waiting for the right moment to surface. He began frequenting the pool more often. Initially, I dismissed it as coincidence, but then I started noticing patterns. He'd arrive just minutes before me, or I'd find him already in the water when I showed up, his gaze meeting mine as I approached, a subtle smile playing on his lips. One evening, the air was thick with the smell of chlorine and the lingering warmth of the sun. I was swimming laps, pushing myself harder than usual, as if I could outswim the thoughts that had begun to occupy my mind. Each time I passed him at the edge of the pool, I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every stroke, every movement. When I finally paused, catching my breath, he was still there, watching, his expression unreadable yet focused. I tried to ignore the way my heart rate accelerated, the way my skin felt hotter under his gaze despite the cool water. "You're getting faster," he commented, a hint of a smile in his voice. For some reason, that simple remark felt like a compliment. "Guess I've had a lot of practice," I replied, attempting to keep my tone light and casual. But even as I spoke, I could feel the tension returning, filling the silence between us. It was like a game we were playing, each of us testing the waters, pushing boundaries we weren't even certain existed. There was a pause, and I thought that might be the end of it, that he'd simply nod and return to his thoughts, as he usually did. But then he surprised me. "You know," he began, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, "we've spent more time together this summer than we have in years." I blinked, taken aback. He was right, of course, but hearing him acknowledge it made it feel different, more real. "I guess we have," I responded, unsure how to react. A part of me wanted to say more, to ask him why he'd noticed, why he cared, but I couldn't bring myself to break the delicate silence that had fallen over us, afraid that anything I said might shatter it. We floated there side by side, the water gently rocking us back and forth. Even though we weren't touching, I could feel the heat radiating from him, the space between us feeling somehow too small, too intimate. Every glance, every ripple of water felt weighted with an unspoken significance neither of us could deny. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow on the water, I found myself wondering what had changed between us, and if there was any way to go back. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. We'd crossed an invisible boundary, one I hadn't even realized was there until it was too late. And in that quiet, shared moment, I understood that whatever this was, it wasn't just a fleeting summer fling. It was something more, something I wasn't sure either of us was prepared for. After that night, everything felt different. It was as if an invisible thread had been drawn between us, connecting us in ways I couldn't explain. Every time I considered going to the pool, my heart would race, a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning within me. I didn't know if he felt the same, but there was something in his gaze, something in the air between us, that made it impossible to ignore. One afternoon I found him at the pool already, his back to me as he floated languidly, arms outstretched, eyes closed. For a moment, I simply observed him, trying to decipher the jumble of emotions swirling within me. He must have sensed my presence because he opened his eyes, glancing over with a soft, almost indecipherable expression. "Thought you weren't coming," he murmured, his voice low, as if he were afraid to disturb the tranquility of the moment. "I almost didn't," I replied, feeling a strange pang of guilt, although I wasn't sure why. It was odd how we'd fallen into this unspoken routine, orbiting each other in a strange magnetic pull neither of us seemed capable of resisting. I slipped into the water, maintaining a distance, and for a while we just floated there, allowing the silence to stretch between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but there was an intensity to it that made my skin tingle, my heart beating faster than I cared to admit. After a few minutes he broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you ever feel, I don't know, like there's more to this?" He looked at me, his eyes searching, as if hoping I'd have the answer he didn't. I froze, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to laugh and pretend I didn't understand what he meant. But I did. I knew exactly what he meant, and pretending otherwise felt dishonest. "Yeah," I finally admitted, my voice soft, almost as if I were confessing it to myself for the first time. "Sometimes," he nodded, his gaze returning to the water. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a quiet yearning that tugged at something deep within me. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance that felt both too close and too far, but I didn't know how. Not yet. We spent the remainder of the afternoon in a comfortable silence, the tension between us simmering just below the surface. I kept expecting him to say something, to break the spell we seemed to be under, but he didn't. And when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the pool in a warm, fading light, I realized I didn't want him to. For the first time I felt something akin to peace, a quiet acceptance of the strange, unspoken bond that had formed between us. It was fragile, delicate, but it was ours, and that was enough. A few days later, I found myself pacing restlessly around the house, my thoughts returning to the pool, to him. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see his gaze, feel the weight of the thick, undeniable silence that had enveloped us. I'd been avoiding the pool, uncertain what I would say or do if I saw him again. But that afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, stretching long shadows across the backyard, I couldn't resist any longer. I grabbed my towel and headed out, my heart pounding with each step. When I arrived, he was already in the water, floating near the edge with his back to me. For a moment I just watched him, a strange mixture of nerves and excitement churning within me. Then, taking a deep breath, I entered the water, the coolness enveloping my skin, grounding me. He turned as I approached, his eyes meeting mine with the same quiet intensity I had come to recognize. There was no smile this time, no casual nod, just a thick, heavy silence hanging between us like an unanswered question we were both afraid to ask. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite identify, something almost vulnerable. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. "I just needed some time to think," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "About what?" he asked, his gaze steady, unwavering. There was no accusation in his tone, just a quiet curiosity, a need to understand. I looked away, feeling the weight of his question settle upon me. "About us," I finally admitted, the words feeling strange, unfamiliar. "About whatever this is." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. A yearning, a quiet intensity that mirrored the feelings I'd been trying so hard to suppress. Without thinking, I moved closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of his skin, the gentle ripples of the water between us. He didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned in, his eyes locked on mine, his expression open, vulnerable. And then, without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a touch so soft, so tentative, that it made my heart race. It was such a small gesture, so simple, but in that moment it felt like everything. Like a line we'd been tiptoeing around for weeks had finally been crossed. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Instead, I let my fingers intertwine with his, the warmth of his skin sending a shiver down my spine, a thrill I couldn't ignore. We stood there, side by side in the water, the world around us fading away until it was just the two of us, connected by something neither of us fully understood but couldn't deny. There were no words, no explanations, just a quiet, unspoken connection that had been building for so long, finally finding expression in the silence. And as the sun sank below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water, I knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever questions or challenges we might face, we would face them together. Because in that moment, I understood that we had crossed a line, one we could never uncross. And for the first time, I felt ready to see where it would lead us.